The 10th section of Twilight of the Idols, Skirmishes of an Untimely Man, is the longest section in the book. It runs to almost 44 pages. The title should bring to mind the title of Nietzsche's previous book, Untimely Meditations. It refers to his unpopular or misunderstood thoughts, and, as the name Skirmishes suggests, this section overall lacks narrative or unity. Among the first 20 sections, Nietzsche goes back and forth between commenting on or insulting other authors, and here he basically invents the MeanTweet, and some observations on psychology and art, and the Apollinian and the Dionysian concepts from his previous work, The Birth of Tragedy. Section 5 deals with George Eliot, the English author. Eliot is a non-Christian who retains Christian morality on a secular basis. She tries to show how one can be good without God. This is an English habit that Nietzsche despises, and he makes a couple of observations about the unity of Christian faith and Christian morals, which form part of his critique of secular modernity. When one gives up Christian faith, one pulls the right to Christian morality out from under one's feet, and Christianity is a system, a whole view of things thought out together. By breaking one main concept out of it, the faith in God, one breaks the whole. Nothing necessary remains in one's hands. In other sections early in this part, Nietzsche discusses the nature of art. Art, he says, depends upon frenzy, upon the feeling of increased strength and fullness. Seen in this light, Christianity is the anti-artistic religion par excellence. As a mode of being, it doesn't simply impede the activity of art and its creation. It, in fact, performs precisely the opposite function. It impoverishes all things. It sucks the life out of them. Nietzsche also takes issue with the Darwinian account of the struggle for survival. He says behind the struggle for survival and reproduction and existence is a much deeper struggle for power. Darwin, in a sense, hasn't gone deep enough to identify the will to power as the fundamental life force, Nietzsche thinks. And in section 18, Nietzsche notes that the current age does not even have enough faith to be hypocritical. He writes, "I fear greatly that modern man is simply too comfortable for some vices, so that they die out by default. All evil that is a function of a strong will degenerates into virtue in our tepid air." I think he sounds like a villain from a G.K. Chesterton novel when he talks like this. Our judgments of beauty and ugliness, Nietzsche thinks, have a physiological origin. Ugliness is the name we give to our reaction to decay, danger, impotence, and all that weakens man. Beauty is our feeling of power, courage, pride, and will to power. The ugly, then, is a symptom of degeneration, and the beautiful is a symptom of health. Ugliness, says Nietzsche, is a symbolic representation of our instinctive hatred for the decline of our type. And it is because of hatred that art is deep. In the middle sections of this long part, Nietzsche discusses Schopenhauer, Christianity, and morality. In section 33, he notes that not all self-interest is equally valuable. The value of self-interest depends upon the quality of the self doing the valuing. Every individual may be scrutinized, Nietzsche writes, to see whether he represents the ascending or the descending line of life. And he tells us the ascending individual is valuable for nature or for life as a whole, and the descending individual, he says, is a parasite, and in all decency should try to take as little as possible from the successful. In section 34, he makes a brief observation about complaining. Complaining, he says, stems from weakness. There's always a desire for revenge behind every complaint. And Christians and anarchists, he says, are both types of degenerate who must assign blame for their suffering. The Christian blames himself, the anarchist blames other people. Nietzsche seems to suggest here that the proper move is not to blame anyone. Altruism, he says, is always a sign of decadence and decline. Choosing against one's advantage betrays a lack of self-worth. Man is finished when he becomes altruistic. Instead of saying naively, "I am no longer worth anything," the moral lie in the mouth of the decadent says, "Nothing is worth anything. Life is not worth anything." We see here again the pattern of Nietzsche identifying the projection of the modern decadent weak person and culture. What really is of value about his own worth, he projects outward onto the world around him and calls it an objective reality. In section 36, a very disturbing section, Nietzsche openly calls for eugenics, euthanasia, and suicide. He claims that even the so-called natural death is unnatural. In the final third of this long part, Nietzsche discusses morality, freedom, and modernity, and he concludes with some thoughts about Goethe as a model for his own project. In section 37, Nietzsche suggests that modern men really have not become moral in the way that they think they have. We modern men really have the conceit that this tender humanity which we represents positive progress, and that in this respect we are far above the men of the Renaissance. But that is how every age thinks, how it must think. In fact, Nietzsche says, there is no moral progress, but we moderns have weaker and more delicate constitutions that makes it seem to be so. This decline in vitality is a decrease in the hostile and mistrustful instincts in modern man, and this is what we call progress. To stronger men of a previous era, with a fuller and stronger will to power, our virtues would be recognized as cowardice and wretchedness. Our morality of sympathy, pity, and equality, says Nietzsche, is a sign of our lack of self-assurance. It's a sign of decadence. In section 38, Nietzsche discusses liberalism and freedom. He notes that liberal institutions do not promote freedom, but the war for liberal institutions does. The struggle is what generated freedom. For what is freedom? That one has the will to assume responsibility for oneself. Freedom means that the manly instincts which delight in war and victory dominate over other instincts, for example, those of pleasure. The free man is a warrior. Freedom is measured by resistance overcome, exertion required to remain on top. Peoples who have achieved greatness did not do so under liberal institutions. They became free on their way toward having liberal institutions. Nietzsche says it is danger alone that forces us to be strong. Section 39 is Nietzsche's critique of modernity. He begins by observing that Western institutions are no good anymore. Everybody agrees about that. But this is not the fault of the institutions, it's our fault, because we as people have lost the instincts that those institutions require. We are no longer fit for them. Institutions require a will or instinct or imperative which is anti-liberal to the point of malice, writes Nietzsche. It requires a will to tradition or to authority. And he gives the example of the institution of modern marriage, which has lost its rational foundations. He thinks these are the husband's juridical role, its indissolubility, and the family's role in choosing the spouse. Modern marriage has lost its meaning, and consequently one abolishes it, writes Nietzsche. In section 47, Nietzsche observes that culture begins not in the soul, but in the body, and therefore Christianity, which despised the body, has been the greatest misfortune of humanity. In the final sections of this long part, Nietzsche discusses the 18th and 19th century poet Goethe, who sought a free spirit in the Nietzschean sense. And yet, the remainder of the 19th century did not produce free spirits, but rather a decline and a nihilistic sigh of resignation. Nietzsche asks, does this mean that Goethe's project was in vain? And then he says, but one misunderstands great human beings if one views them from the miserable perspective of some public use. And I think he's here suggesting an evaluation of his own work as well. He discusses his project in the final section of this part. Why does Nietzsche write in German, since most Germans understand him so poorly? And Nietzsche answers, perhaps he does not want to be understood. Perhaps he is creating something great for the ages, indifferent to his contemporaries. He writes, the aphorism, the apothegm, in which I am the first among the Germans to be the master, are forms of eternity. It is my ambition to say in 10 sentences what everyone else says in a book, what everyone else does not say in a book. I have given mankind the most profound book it possesses, my Zarathustra. Shortly I shall give it the most independent. And he here is referring to the Antichrist, the first volume of his projected Revaluation of All Values project. This brings us to the end of Skirmishes of an Untimely Man, the 10th section of Twilight of the Idols. We'll talk about the 11th section, What I Owe to the Ancients, next. Goodbye.